Good April morning. We are almost to mid-April here in Southwest Michigan, and I'm standing outside of my two garden beds. They are each 40 foot by 30 foot. And if you've been watching the videos, you've been watching us prepare this one over here and plant out our cool season plants. And this one over here is still cooking for my warm and hot season plants. Now today specifically, I want to go into a thorough discussion about weed control or weed suppression using the method that I've chosen to use as a gardener, which is considered no dig or lasagna gardening, however you decide to term it. This is basically how I've always done gardening, using a lasagna gardening method, which you can see in my video here. But the gist of it is, and we just moved onto this property. Before I tell you the gist, we just moved onto this property now I have to think, this past October was 1 year. So we're almost at a year and a half. And this whole area where the gardens are, all of this was woody weeds. And you can't tell right now because it's early spring, but all the pasture behind these gardens will be filled with 3 foot tall brambles, weeds, milkweed, thistles, Queen Anne's lace. Beautiful when you, goldenrod, that's another one. It's beautiful to look at, but you don't want it in your garden. So that's what all of this was when we moved in here, and we had to clear it. We did do some tilling the first year just to kind of bring up some of those bigger roots that were harder to pull out by hand. And essentially what I'm doing now is, and what I've been doing since gardening last spring, is building from the soil up to where each year I'm not having to dig to set my plants. Now, the first year on a property like this with a no dig style gardening, which was last summer, you're going to have a much heavier weed burden as you're trying to smother out those weeds and really kill the parent root down below. And last year I did battle weeds more than I wanted to, especially over on that side of the garden and here where I'm about to show you. And part of that is because I just didn't have the time necessarily to do what I really wanted to do, which was lay cardboard down. I did lay cardboard down in some areas, but I wasn't able to get the entire bed, because obviously this is a large bed, covered in cardboard or a really thick mulch to suppress those weeds. In some areas of the garden, I was able to do that, and those areas were much more manageable, and this year show little to no sign of weeds, which is pretty amazing given that this is only the second year on basically raw ground. So what I want to show you in this video is how you can take property like this, or even your own backyard if you're just dealing with sod and weeds, and turn it into basically something that looks like this without having to dig every year, without having to battle major weeds. I'll tell you not necessarily what I did wrong, but why I battled them this year and how I'm correcting things this year so I don't have to battle them as bad. So basically weed control is what we're talking about using the lasagna gardening or no dig style of gardening. So you might be asking, what's the benefit of doing a lasagna style garden or a no dig garden versus your kind of typical gardening, which is maybe digging up the dirt each year to plant your plants? There's a lot of benefits, and I'll have to cover that in another blog post or video, but the gist of it is you are building the soil from the bottom up. You're adding microbes, you're adding nutrients, you're adding organic matter by simply layering on top of the ground versus digging down. Then you're not having to add fertilizers, synthetic fertilizers in particular, which really aren't that great for your plants and your soil. But you're building your soil using things like wood chips, leaves, whether they're dried or decomposed, manures, straw, hay, as long as they're not sprayed, grasses, as long as they're not sprayed, vegetable scraps from your kitchen. You can learn more about it in my lasagna gardening video, but you're really creating an amazing ecosystem here in your soil by simply adding things on top and things that you generally have in your backyard or on your property. And by adding a certain amount, you can suppress the weeds, whether perennial or annual weeds, down below. So I'm going to show you in this garden specifically how we've actually done 2 different methods in one garden. So you can see behind me here, I've got basically 3/4 of this garden covered in a black, maybe a polyurethane tarp. I'm not actually for sure what the material is, but it's a thick, opaque, dark tarp. So in this case, we just laid a really thick, probably 4 to 6 inches of wood chips and other organic material in this bed without a tarp. And coming and looking at it right now here in the early spring when all the weeds are starting to pop up, it looks really good. Compared to what we were dealing with last year, this looks amazing. And I mean, this is great progress for only 1 year in this garden. And I'll show you the weeds here in a second and how I plan to address them moving forward this year. The second way you can address a weed burden is by covering with tarps. You can either in either of these situations, you can lay cardboard underneath right above the surface of the ground, right above the surface of the sod or the weeds or whatever you're dealing with. You can lay cardboard down and then put your compost and mulches on top of that, either thickly, like 4 to 6 inches like we did here, or thin. You could do even 1 to 2 inches of compost or manure or wood chips. And then if you only have access to like a thin mulch, lay the tarp on top of that. And what this is doing is, again, creating a barrier to smother out the weeds below the surface. In this sense, and really in this sense too, if it's thick enough, you're canceling out the light. The weeds have to work harder to get to the light. In this case, they'll never get to the light, right? And they're trying to grow in the darkness, and it's going to end up expending their energy. And eventually over time, given this same circumstance, those weeds will eventually die. In this case, they can eventually get access to the light, depending on how thickly you do your mulch, but they're much easier to pull up. And as long as you're continually pulling up these weeds once or twice a week, the parent root down below will die eventually. They will lose energy to keep sending up shoots. It's fighting to get to the surface of this thick mulch, and eventually they'll die off. It may take a little bit longer, but they will eventually die off. In this situation, if I were to pull this back for you, and I probably should, there are still what looks like lots of weeds under here, but you can tell they're starting to turn white or yellow. You know, they don't have access to the light, so they will still be here, but they're going to be a lot weaker and much more manageable. So I have 2 choices here, depending on what this is looking like when I'm ready to plant in it here in the next month. And I am weighing out these options right now. We have a wood chip pile right here, which we're still using to fill in pathways over in this garden, in which starting today, we're going to start moving the rest of those wood chips in here. We're going to pull back these tarps, we're going to lay down the wood chips, and then we're going to cover them back up. And my thinking is, by the time I plant out here, first week, second week of May, this is going to be a non-issue. Now there's still going to be maybe a sprout or 2 sitting up, but I can pull those up, and eventually, like I said, it's going to die over time. Or I could leave the tarps and for this season and poke holes in them and actually plant my plants down in those holes. And that will really deal with this weed situation, because right over here is where I had battled lots and lots and lots of weeds last year in my potato beds. We still had a great potato harvest despite that, but I don't want to be doing that every year. So what I may do is leave a portion of this covered with a tarp, probably this back portion that I know struggles the most with the heavier weeds. And I may plant my squashes and my cucumbers actually into the tarp, cut a hole, dig out some dirt with my trowel, and plant an already started plant. I'm actually going to start today or tomorrow in my house, in there, so that it will grow on top but not have to battle the weeds. And at the same time, I'm providing a really nice hot warm soil, which those plants like, and I'm killing out the weeds underneath. So you see how that all works together. Let's take a look at this situation here where we've done option 1 with just a really thick layer of compost or mulch. And really, again, I'm just taking a sweep. There's really not that many weeds that I'm battling here. So what you can do is you can come up to a weed like this even though it's really pretty with its little flowers. And you can give it a tug and it's either gonna come out just like that. This is probably an annual weed right here. And just throw it on the surface and it's just gonna die and decompose into these wood chips. That was easy enough. This right here is gonna be more of a perennial weed that if I give it a tug, yeah, there's a root system down there. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna get my trowel and I'm just gonna dig down a bit and pull it up. And I'm gonna flip it over here on top. And again, the heat will kill it. It'll eventually decompose and become one with the ground. Now, here's another one of the main weeds that we deal with. This is the Queen Anne's lace. It looks like dill and parsley and carrots, and that's because they're all in the same family, those kind of like frilly leaves. And this plant has a taproot. A taproot, if you think of a carrot or a parsnip, that's a taproot. So it's pretty deep, and I have to get down there and dig it up. This soil is way easier to dig in this year than it was last year. So, oops, I didn't get the taproot, but there's the leaves. Taproot's in here somewhere. Maybe that was it. Maybe it was a really immature taproot. I'll find a better example, but there, just dug it right up. So those are gone. Let's look right here. Just gonna dig this one up. I know that this is a thicker one because I was looking at it earlier. So you can see that root system. Yeah, this is a baby Queen Anne's lace. There's your taproot. That's what we're looking for. Just pull that up. Now in this garden bed, I did a similar thing. In some areas, we had laid down cardboard last year, and you can see remnants of it's left over. But in those areas where I had laid down those cardboard or other things to smother out the roots, when I came out here this year, there was basically bare ground, which is great. Just telling me that that barrier we laid right on the surface of the ground and then covered with organic material, including wood chips and straw, did its job of killing out those weeds. And now I can just continue to build on top of the soil. And I'm gonna show you that right here in just a second. Here's the area right here where we had a really nice barrier laid right here last year. And you can see that there are little to no weeds at all. Here's one little grass right there, but like nothing at all in this ground, which is, again, really hard to believe given that this was covered in all kinds of weeds and woody weeds, perennial weeds, all kinds of things. It was completely covered when we planted in here last year, and now there's nothing. Now I am gonna come in here and continue to fill in this area right here with wood chips. That's my goal today, to finish this, and that'll keep the weed and the weed seeds from getting in here and trying to grow. We've got a little bit of grass here that I can just dig up and pull out. I'm not gonna do that right now, but I'll come in here and get that out. And again, I'm gonna have an issue with grass trying to get in right here, but my goal is to come and either to weed eat it and then lay a bunch of wood chips, or just come and lay cardboard straight on top of it and then lay wood chips. And that will help keep this grass from trying to creep into the garden here. If you've watched my videos, you've seen that I've been working on these pathways. And this area over here specifically is where I had major weed issues last year. In fact, so bad that it killed out all my garlic. My onions made it, although not all. So right now, you see nothing except for a little grass over here that we're gonna be dealing with today. So what I've done is I've laid cardboard over all of this. All of this back part has cardboard right on the surface of the dirt where the weeds are. And then I've covered it with compost from the chicken run. And this one right here, just straight wood chips, about probably 3-4 inches. I could add more, and I might, just depending on how much we have left in our pile. But I'm just gonna let this sit. But eventually we will be using this for some of our garden. And here in the next 4 or 5 months, when I start working on planting the fall garden, this will be great. And most of these, if not all of these weeds, will be completely gone and suppressed. It will make for a much easier, planting moving forward. See how great all this looks? We have very few weeds. Here's some grass that I've got to come take care of. And this is the area that's really trying to come through. You can see how nice this looks back over here But right here, this is where some cardboard didn't get laid or enough wood chips didn't get laid over the winter. We did miss some areas. So I've got all these weeds trying to come through. So my plan is I'm actually gonna scrape all of this back down to the surface of the dirt. I'm gonna lay some cardboard right here. This is probably like a 4x6 or 4x5 plot. Lay some cardboard, move it all back over, and then I can use this if I need to plant plants that are growing inside right now. So that will help with this, just covering it thickly with either cardboard or 4 to 6 inches of mulch and compost. And that will take care of that problem. But other than that, this area is looking really good. And that is how we are dealing with these weeds and eventually turning this whole garden and eventually more gardens on this property into a no dig, no till, above ground garden. So again, I hope that's helpful. Weeds are such an issue, and I know I had a family member lose almost her entire garden last year to weeds because they became so unmanageable. She just kind of gave up. And I think we can all relate to that. But I would say the key to weed management is, number one, staying on top of it. If your garden is too big for you to manage, that's one thing to consider. You can actually grow a lot of food in a smaller space. So if you're feeling overwhelmed by the weeds this year, maybe try doing intensive gardening, which I have in a blog post I'll list below, where you can really get a lot of plants in a smaller area, and then there's less that you're having to manage. And intensive gardening, the way that it works with all these plants that really closely planted together, actually smother out weeds that are trying to get in and can really help with that weed burden. So there's an idea for you. And then other than that, what we've talked about here, basically finding a way to smother out the weeds so they lose energy and can't get to the surface. So again, that's either laying cardboard on the surface of the ground and then laying compost or mulch, organic material on top that you can actually plant right into. That cardboard will break down over time and the roots will go through. You can plant right into it, have an instant garden. That's sort of the lasagna style gardening. You can lay mulch or compost down, lay a tarp on top to really help out with a heavier weed burden. You can plant straight down into that tarp, or you can wait a season if you can to use that garden plot later. But the whole idea of what you're doing is you're smothering out the weeds, you're making them put more energy into growth, which they will eventually die out. And then you're adding to the surface of your ground versus taking away. You're adding organic material, you're adding mulches, you're adding compost thickly, if possible, to help smother out those weeds, or use the cardboard again as a barrier, and then thinly compost on top. And eventually you'll find yourself really battling little to no weeds. It can take you one day a week really to come out here and pull off the annuals, pull out a few grass roots, and it won't be sucking up your energy and your time and your garden over time. So that's the goal. Option one, lay cardboard and a thin mulch on top or thin compost on top. Option two, lay down some compost, lay a tarp on top, and then plant directly into it or let it sit over time. So that's my suggestion. But basically it's the no dig, no till lasagna garden way of managing weeds. And I have found it over the years to be extremely helpful. So I hope that's helpful. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next video.